Deputy Speaker.
What's the action?
Welcome back, members. I recognize the member for Tobago East as the next member.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, for the opportunity to contribute to this very important bill. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we would all acknowledge in this honourable House that sexual violence is a grievous violation of human rights. We will also acknowledge that acts of sexual violence not only affect the victims themselves, but also their family and the communities. The perpetration of sexual violence is a challenge that is widespread and worldwide, and consequently, there has been resounding global response to this threat to human life and violation of human rights. The global response to sexual violence includes several international and regional treaties, consensus documents, measures, and strategies aimed at eliminating violence, and in particular, sexual violence against women and children. Mr. Deputy Speaker, notwithstanding local, regional, and international strategies, sexual violence perpetrated against women and girls remain a very pervasive issue. I stand in support of the measures proposed in this bill, as I see the particular legislation as an addition in the tool in our fight to protect our women and our girls from sexual violence. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Office of the Prime Minister, which is charged with the responsibility of gender and child affairs, foresee this legislation working in tandem with structural developments that have already been introduced and those soon to be implemented to protect the nation's vulnerable. Additionally, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the legislation will create further reinforcement for the programs that address the socio-cultural transformations needed to treat with the underlying factors that drive gender-based violence and child abuse. Now, before I go further into my presentation, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I would like to respond to some of the concerns raised by the member for Couva North during her presentation in this honourable House. The member would have asked about the provisions of transitional homes and places of safety for women, as well as domestic violence shelters. And she would have alluded to the fact that some of the initiatives would have started under the previous administration. And I agree. Government is a continuum. After one government moves, another will come in and build on what would have established, sometimes enhance it, make it better, as we are doing. But at the end of the day, we always strive to ensure that we provide what is best for the people of the country, particularly in all circumstances. We are trying to ensure we provide what is best for the women and children, those vulnerable people in our society. So in terms of transition facilities, we would have inherited a facility that was open. However, on visiting the facility when I came into office, it was still a construction site. So it took us some time to have the facility completed and handing over to be used as a transition facility for men. At present, we are currently working with other agencies to ensure that we have transition facilities for girls established throughout Trinidad and Tobago. In this honourable House, on more than one occasion, I would have made a plea to the public and to the NGOs asking to partner with us to provide shelters for victims of domestic violence. I would have mentioned the fact that we would have established some facilities and we would have sent out for tenders for people to manage the facilities. And to date, we have still not been successful to get any NGO body coming forward to manage the facilities. So we are currently looking at ways that we could restructure the management program to ensure that the women, the boys and the girls of Trinidad and Tobago who desperately need a place of safety when they are faced with domestic violence could actually have use of the buildings that we already have established in Trinidad. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we are also partnering with NGO in Tobago as well as the Tobago House of Assembly to ensure that we provide facilities on the sister island so that all women, boys and girls in Trinidad and Tobago have a place of safety if they are faced with domestic violence. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I want to focus on some of the benefits of the bill. It is a fact that no single piece of law in itself can solve a societal ill. However, within the framework of a sound legislative agenda, effective programming and rollout of initiatives, there can be some success and meaningful impact. The work we are doing here today, the work we would have done in terms of the package of children's legislation, and the work we are currently doing in terms of the amendments to the Domestic Violence Act, a testament that the government of Trinidad and Tobago is committed to developing the structures necessary to end all forms of violence against women and children. It demonstrates the fact that we are committed to a mandate of putting people first, nurturing our greatest asset, and we are doing so by improving the legislative framework, the administration of justice and law enforcement, as well as focused programming and improved service delivery. Mr. Deputy Speaker, in addition to the bill being harmonized with key legislation that seek to safeguard our children and women, another benefit of the bill is that it makes provisions that are expected to encourage reporting of abuse, especially in cases involving children. Furthermore, Mr. Deputy Speaker, by expanding the number of offences for which specified persons are to report suspected abuse of minor, it is envisaged that persons aware of child abuse will be moved to report. And this is important. Recently, I came across a situation where a child was abused and adults knew about it. And for some reason, they weren't reporting it. If a child is being abused, and if persons who are in authority, adults who are charged with securing and safeguarding a child don't report it, then we are not only doing that child a disservice, but we are doing the country a disservice. Because the only way we could act, the only way the Children's Authority could be effective is if we report. The only way the police service would be able to act, the only way the police service would be able to bring perpetrators to justice is if we report. So this measure within the legislation is going to help to prompt those people who know of abuse being perpetrated against children and sometimes even women and who fail to report it. It would encourage them to do the right thing, Mr. Deputy Speaker. But even having the legislation in place, what we really is that need in Trinidad and Tobago is a change of mindset, a transformation of the way we think and the way we act. And we as a government, we are putting measures in place. We're not just tackling from the side of law, but in terms of our programs, in terms of our policies, in terms of the way we sensitize the public, in terms of the way we educate the public on measures available to safeguard them. That is the approach that we are taking, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, this particular piece of legislation also supports the work of the Children's Authority, as I would have mentioned before. It supports the work of the Child Protection Unit of Trinidad and Tobago and all those other agencies working to protect our nation's children. The merits of a sexual offender register is often the debate often a topic of hot debate. I remember looking at a movie called Those Beautiful Bones, and the movie was telling the story of how a particular state in the United States of America would have enacted their sex offenders registry. And in that particular story, I remember the young girl was taken on her way home from school. And the perpetrator would have been someone who would have committed an act of sexual violence in another state and would have moved into her community, and nobody knew that he was an offender. And I remember looking at the movie and looking at the little girl in the movie, and I remember feeling the hurt and the pain of her mother, because I have 2 daughters, when for weeks she would have been traversing the community looking for her daughter. And in all that time, her daughter was right within the community in an underground bunker. When they did find the body, it was just bones, hence the name, Those Beautiful Bones. And because of that experience, it would have forced that state to really now make the sex offender register public so people could know where people are located. So if you move into a state, you have a right to report it out. The state residents will know that you are in our community and will be able to safeguard and protect themselves and the children. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I know in Trinidad and Tobago that the debate will continue if our register should be public, if it should be private. Personally, I would like it to be public. Some people may argue that we will be violating the rights of the perpetrators, but what about the rights of the victim? What about the rights of the family? What about the rights of the communities, Mr. Deputy Speaker? So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I see the fact that we have actually started by putting and modernizing our register and having it in the legislation as a positive step towards helping to safeguard the nation's children and helping to safeguard those vulnerable in our communities, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, in terms of protection, the bill also states that an offender on being charged would have to be tested for sexually transmitted infections, and that is very important for the offender to be tested at the time of being charged. I remember as a young lady at university, around my 2nd year going to my 3rd year, I would have enrolled in a program where I was a facilitator, and we were working with communities, at-risk communities and schools, providing awareness about HIV and AIDS as well as mental health. And we had to work with families and we had to work with the communities. And I remember there was a case that came to me, and I still remember it today. There was a little baby, a little child under the age of 1, who would have contracted a sexually transmitted infection. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, I remember within the family, the older siblings would have also been abused. However, the perpetrator was never tested until this baby started presenting with signs of anal warts. And I remember as a university student how that troubled me, that it was only when it got to the stage where it's almost, you couldn't really do anything to treat it, that they were able to find out. And that's when they decided to test the other children in the home, and they also were infected. So if on being charged, the offender is forced to do the test, then we're giving the victims the opportunity to get early treatment. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we're creating an opportunity to help to save a life and to also creating the opportunity for somebody to have a better outcome in the future. But added to that is the fact that through this piece of legislation would have been included in it is that the victims now can receive compensation. I mean, no amount of money, no amount of compensation could repay you for lost innocence or for the damage done to your body, but at least it would help a family, especially a family that has the need to seek the relevant care for the child or the woman, or if it's a man, to seek the relevant care to ensure they have a better outcome. And that was a question asked by the member for Couva North, what provisions are in place to provide, compensation, etc., for victims. So I want to commend the Honorable Attorney General and the team for putting such measures in place that our victims could further have retribution, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I don't want to be very long because a lot of the data I would have wanted to present would have been shared by my colleagues on the other side as well as the Honorable Attorney General. But I want to put it in the context of what we are doing. I remember being asked a question in this House as well as in the upper house about what the government is doing to sensitize the public, to create awareness around the rights of the child, to create awareness about issues of gender-based violence, and also to create awareness around issues of gender and gender equality, etc. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I am really happy to be able to announce to this Honourable House that for the period of fiscal 2018, from October 2018 to September 2019, in terms of child protection, in terms of providing information on protecting our child, the rights of the child, legislation around children, information on child abuse, we would have been able to personally interact with 9,217 individuals in Trinidad and Tobago. And if you consider the ripple-on effect of this 9,000 plus individuals going out and talking to one more person, and a person going and talking to one more person, we are creating awareness of issues around child abuse. So some of the workshop would have included reaching out to our early childhood care and education tutors. We'd have met with educators in Trinidad, 44. In Tobago, 39 early childhood care education tutors. In terms of private tutors, we met with 31 in Tobago West. In North Trinidad, 137. In South Trinidad, 109. A total of 360 early childhood care and education tutors were trained around the legislation, around the rights of the child, around issues of reporting and safeguarding children. Now, those 360 individuals trained will now have the opportunity to interact with the school community and their own community that's spreading the information. If we are to achieve the change in mindset we want, if we have to achieve the transformation we want, we must educate, we must sensitize, we must empower our citizens, and we are doing that, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, in terms of outreach to the youth, we had a youth outreach workshop in Tobago. We had 29 participants, and in Trinidad, we had 28 participants, 57 in total. In terms of coaches, umpires and cricketers, because we know that children often interact closely with coaches and people in the sporting discipline, we felt that it was necessary for us to train the coaches and provide information. 155 individuals were trained under the category of coaches, umpires, and cricketers, Mr. Deputy Speaker. In terms of our Child Protection League and Interactive Fair, we were able to engage 850 individuals, 700 children, and 150 adults, again providing information around the legislation for children, child abuse, child development, child rights, reporting, and safeguarding children. Our Return to Happiness workshop in 2018 would have facilitated 128 individuals. Mr. Deputy Speaker, in terms of our Child Rights Ambassador program, we were able to train 7,545 individuals. That would have included adults and children. And in terms of our training for caregivers in our various community residences, we were able to train 122 individuals. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, in terms of providing information about the rights of the child and how children should be protected, etc., we would have been going out there and sensitizing the public, and we have done it, Mr. Deputy Speaker, with limited resources. So I want to commend the team at the Office of the Prime Minister and commend my colleagues for supporting us in our various initiatives. Mr. Deputy Speaker, in terms of issues around women and safeguarding women, we would have partnered with the NGO sector. An initiative I would like to highlight that is garnering success and attention throughout the nation is our Shades of Aishi, Every Woman's Story is a Play, based on gender-based violence. I think we are supposed to be going to Chaguanas East next. We would have sent the communication to your office. Now, Shades of Aishi, Every Woman's Story, it presents to the public issues around gender-based violence. So, rape, domestic violence, incest, etc. And what it does is uses edutainment to bring the discussion forward and help the community to really tackle it face-on, frontal. We would have had it in Lavantil East Mova. We're going to Tobago this weekend, and we're hopefully going to Chaguanas East and go to all 41 constituencies, because we realize that once we engage the citizens in ways that they could associate with, using things that they enjoy, theater, art, dance, that we could start the conversation around these issues and again bring about the change in mindset that we need in Trinidad and Tobago at this point in time. Mr. Deputy Speaker, coming in the next fiscal year, we are going to be rolling out a fighting chance initiative for women and girls, and it's a self-defense program, because we recognize we could put in the laws, we could put in the programs and the policies, but if our girls and our women don't know how to fight back and defend themselves, then they're going to remain victims. And we don't want our women and our girls to remain victims. We want them to become overcomers and survivors. So we are going to be training them in self-defense in the coming fiscal year, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, in July, we would have launched our SARA project, that is Safeguarding and Rescuing All Humans from Trafficking. We would have launched this initiative in South Trinidad and partner with Phoenix Gas Processors, because we recognize that most of the female victims of trafficking come in from the Southern Peninsula. And when they come in, most times they end up being exploited sexually. And what we are trying to do is to open up the conversation around the areas where we will find most of the victims presenting, around how it affects not only the women, but also the immediate community. Because most times when the men go out and they interact with a lady, they may contract something, then take it into their home, and then it ripples on. So we're trying to see how we could really create the discussion around the issue of human trafficking and when victims are sexually exploited and how it impacts on the wider community, the wider society, to help to curb the issue, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And that was successfully launched, as I said, in July this year in South Trinidad. Just this week, we had a two-day workshop in collaboration with the CARICOM Secretariat on the 9th and 10th of September, where we discussed rethinking masculinity, understanding gender equality as a means of ending gender-based violence in Caribbean schools. A study was done, and it showed that concepts around gender-based violence in school wasn't what we wanted it to be. A lot of our boys have been socialized to think that, it's okay to be aggressive and, being macho is about, dominating and all of that. And what we recognize that would have transformed and transferred into instances of violence in our schools. Now, through this workshop, we would have been able to interact with people who work in the education sector, the health sector, as well as NGOs, so that they could create creative interventions to help to curb the incidence of violence in schools, especially in an age where you're seeing more and more on social media, girls being exploited sexually. My daughters are now in high school, and I have a conversation with them almost every day. I say to them, you're at school to learn, you're not at school to pick up anything else other than your books. And I say to my daughters, your phone is for emergency, your phone is for education, your phone is not to be used as a tool to create pornography. We have to start frank and open discussion in our communities, because people think it's okay. They think it's okay to engage in the act, they think it's okay to videotape, and they think it's okay to share. We have to start talking that it is wrong. Every time you share a WhatsApp video with an adult having sex with a minor, you're encouraging pornography. It is wrong. Every time you use your phone to videotape minors in the act of having sexual intercourse, you're doing something wrong. But you see, we live in a society now where we think it's small thing. I will share it around, it's no big deal, but it is wrong. And when we do it, we encourage it, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And as I said before, all that we are doing as a government is not just building out legislation, but building out programs, building out projects and initiatives so that we could target the hearts and the minds of the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago to ensure that we have the right-based society that we want and to ensure that we help to reduce the incidence of violence against our women and our children. Couva North, you weren't in the Honourable House, but I was responding in terms of the facilities that we have, right? And just to let you know that we recognize that it's not for government alone to do it, but for all of society to be engaged in it. And I get this sense that the bill will be supported. And I want to take this opportunity to thank you all for really buying in and supporting us. Because the only way we could change Trinidad and Tobago is if we put aside, at times, our political hats and just start thinking as individuals. You know, because today me, tomorrow you, but if we don't work together, the problems persist. And at the end of the day, it's not UNC that lose out or PN that lose out, but Trinidad and Tobago that will lose out. You know, so we have to, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we have to really work together as a house, as responsible adults and citizens to transform Trinidad and Tobago. At the heart of this piece of legislation, Mr. Deputy Speaker, at the heart of the work that we are doing is the whole concept of transformation, changing the way we act, the way we think, and the way we do things in Trinidad and Tobago, with one goal: a society that values and respects our women, our boys and our girls, a society that frowns on all form of violence, a society that is able to nurture, care, and protect. Mr. Deputy Speaker, whenever I reflect on the statistics coming out of the Children's Authority, I get frightened, because I often say that hurt boys and girls grow up to be angry men and women who then go on, in most instances, to be perpetrators of violence, be perpetrators of crimes. And if we want Trinidad and Tobago to be a different place, we have to do what is right by our children. We have to invest in our children. And I acknowledge the work that the Ministry of Education is doing in terms of helping to address issues of bullying. I address the work that the Ministry of Housing is doing in helping us to find places where we could establish, shelters, etc., and also create opportunities for those people who are transitioning out of community residences to create an environment where they go into a home-like setting and learn to be reintegrated into society. I commend the Minister of Community Development and acknowledge the work that she's doing with the Community Mediation Unit. All that is part of the process. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I commend all the honourable members on this side, because we operate as a team. And in all that we do, we put the people of Trinidad and Tobago first. That is part of our mandate. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I want to again commend the Honourable Attorney General. I commend all those who would have worked on the committee on both sides of the House for the work they would have done. I commend the NGOs who would have come in and shared their different experiences and presented options and solutions for us. And I want to signal to the people of Trinidad and Tobago that the only way that this legislation will be effective is if we do our part. As I said before, if we don't report, the Children's Authority would have nothing to act on. If we do not report, the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service will not have the information to go on. If we do not report, ministries and departments will not get the information and the data required to develop policies and programs. So I call on all citizens for us to work together to help to build a better Trinidad and Tobago. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I thank you.
I recognize Fukumuto Manzelina.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I would just like to extend congratulations to the team. First of all, to the speakers on our side, member for Faizabad, member for Hoover North. And of course, I would like to commend everyone who put together this amendments. It was a lot of work, as all the speakers indicated. Over 500 pages, different documents, and it's really commendable. I just want to add a little bit to some of the things that Member for Tobago East had spoken about, and to indicate that a number of suicides that we are seeing taking place among our youth, we have to address it, because sometimes it comes out of some sort of abuse and sexual abuse, and they are unable to cope with it. They blame themselves, and they think that I'm the one at fault. I'm the one that caused it. And so I'm happy to see that educators were involved in it. 360, according to Member for Tobago East, 360 educators were in fact given the opportunity to understand what this legislation is going to be about, which is important. And I just want to ask a question, because I'm not sure. When I went through the final report and I looked at the various stakeholders, I didn't see religious faith-based organizations a part of the stakeholders. I didn't see it. I'm not saying that it wasn't. And the reason why I think it's important, simply because of the fact that when you have all these stakeholders coming together, education, the police officer, psychiatrists, and so forth, what it allows, and I hope this is what took place at the stakeholders meetings, that you would have been able to give those persons who the children would go to an opportunity to show them what do you do when a child comes to you. You know, do you interrogate the child? Do you try to ascertain whether it is in fact true or not? Or do you automatically take the child to the nearest police station for the officers who are best able to investigate the matter to do the interrogation? So I think it's important. I'm glad that it's happening, and I look forward to when you come into my constituency. I certainly would like to be a part of that program. But more importantly, the operationalization of this act is very important, as we have all believed it to be. And one of the things that I was a little bit, I'm subject to correction, and through you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to the Honorable AG, I know that on page 15 of the section 40, a qualified person who takes an intimate sample, and as I said, I'm subject to correction. But I know that in the amendment, in the administration of the Justice DNA Act, in the second schedule, Form 1, where there's a volunteering of a sample, you have in specifically 40B, it stops at a certain point in the form. And if we have to put in this additional part here, you will have to probably amend that form, which would not really need you don't need to come to Parliament, because 35 of that same act indicates that the minister may by order amend the first and second schedule. And the reason why I'm saying that is because I wouldn't want to think that, that we have everything in place and something does in fact happen and the form is not amended properly to reflect if someone has asked for number 4 to be taken in the presence of someone other than themselves, it's of their sex. Going to page 16. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I don't know how the Attorney General will, but it is important that you ensure that there's adequate financing, adequate funding for when a qualified person has to take samples from a person pursuant to this section. Simply because of the fact you want to ensure that wherever one is going to have their samples taken, that you would have the adequate containers, the supply of containers, the seals and the labels and etc. Because if these are not in place, it would be a travesty of justice, because you would find that persons will have to come back, or the whole process of taking the samples would be in fact delayed. And I know that Dr. Bodo, member for Faizabad, had indicated that to have your a delay in taking the samples could diminish the quality of the sample. And of course, you need to have a proper sample if you have to bring about a conviction and identifying the perpetrator, and for other reasons. So I would hope that in the budget that there would be adequate funding to ensure that that this act can be properly in operation, and that there will not be any hindrances to it. And just coming to, and it's my final point, because I really don't want to stay long, as everyone has more or less spoken on everything else. But on page 21, when we speak about the website not being accessible, there's only, I know that member for Tobago East indicated that there was an incident with a child having an illness, contracted disease, and when the home was tested, there were other children who were in fact, and Mr. Deputy Speaker, you really don't know who is taking care of your child. It could be a pedophile, and we don't know. No. And so as a result of it, it is good for us to be able, as parents, well, I don't have babies, but for parents who have children and require the care of a daycare, to be able to verify whether the daycare is cared for and handled. The owners are in fact outstanding members of the community, and also that they do not have a record, because if you are coming to work for me, I can ask for a police certificate character, and so as a result of it, you would bring that to me, and although it would take 4 to 6 weeks, I have the choice of waiting 4 to 6 weeks. But in a case of where I'm taking my child or my grandchild to a home, it would be important, and the only way we will know is if the website is in fact available. So I know that there is a concern that there may be cases of vigilantes rising up, and of course, I think that the society that we are in is pretty much mature, and we have to be able to work with what it is necessary for the protection of our children. Because as you quite rightly indicated, member for Tobago East, it is a task to protect our children, but that's our responsibility. And therefore, we must be given the tools and the ability to access, even if it is through a FOI, which is done in England, that we have access to the website. But it is in a way of protecting our children, and also in bringing into our schools, because you don't know who you're hiring. And of course, you find that persons, perpetrators, look for easy access and where they have a lot of children in place. So I think it's important to have these measures in place. I commend every member, especially in the Senate, who did yeoman service to this bill, and I look forward to it being operationalized. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the member for Bonnet, Lupino Bonnet.
Okay. That's okay, Caroline. Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, it gives me great pleasure this afternoon to contribute to this debate on an act to amend the Sexual Offences Act, Chapter 1128. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm particularly pleased because I think maybe for the first time since I've been in this House, both sides of the House have come together in terms of this piece of legislation. And so I take the opportunity to commend the Attorney General and his team, to commend members on both sides of the House, and particularly to commend those persons who would have comprised the Special Select Committee of the Senate that would have looked at this piece of legislation. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, when I would have been preparing for this debate and I looked at the amendments, I said to myself there would not be an extensive debate because the committee would have done such good work, and it is evidenced by the numbers and the quality of the amendments in the document. And I am not surprised to hear today the members on the opposite side indicating that they would support the legislation, because they have been saying over and over they support good legislation, and we have good legislation that was made better by the Special Select Committee. And so, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I am very heartened, for as the member for Couva North would have indicated, this debate had to go beyond political lines because we needed to focus on our citizens and on country. And I believe that today we have done that. But Mr. Deputy Speaker, I wish, however, to just make maybe 2 points. One is that I support this bill because it seeks to protect the most vulnerable in society, which most often is our children, our women, and persons with a mental disorder. And they are the ones, unfortunately, who tend to be most affected by sexual crimes and sexual deviance or predators. But the great thing about this piece of legislation, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is that apart from protecting our vulnerable, it also seeks to deal with issues raised in terms of how do we protect the privacy and the sexual offenders. And when I look at section 47.3, I was very heartened in that the sexual offenders register is not going to be available to the public. Now, I listened to my colleague from Commuter Manzanilla, and she was making reference to the website, and I was gleaning from her that she believed the website was not available to the public. But as a matter of fact, Mr. Deputy Speaker, at 48.1, where it says that the Commissioner of Police shall establish a website designated for the publication of the information on registered sex offenders, that information is going to be available to the public, where it provides for protection for the offenders, where it says at 48.4, any person who intentionally and without lawful excuse or justification reproduces, shares, or uses any information contained in the website, they would commit an offense and is liable on summary conviction to a fine of $25,000 and to imprisonment. So we, the members of the public, Mr. Deputy Speaker, do in fact have access to the website. So the concern my colleague would have had where you may have persons. Okay. Anyway, yes, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Based on my reading of the document, there is access, because if there was not access, why is there provision for persons who intentionally misuse it? But we move on. One of the reasons I would have been very happy, Mr. Deputy Speaker, with children being exempt from being included on the National Register for sexual offenders is because we recognize that children do not think as adults. And a child may make a mistake in his young formative years. And as a society, I do not believe that we should hold someone accountable for the rest of his life for something done as a child. Because when we place information with child sex offenders on the National Register, what we are in fact doing is condemning that child for the rest of his life. And I want to make reference here, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to an article titled Against Juvenile Sex Offender Registration. It is by Catherine L. Carpenter, and it can be found in the University of Cincinnati Law Review. And it speaks about a young lady named Leah. Leah was convicted of sexual misconduct and placed on that state's offenders register at age 12. And she would have given an indication of the impact that has had on her life. She's now a qualified person. She would have gone to university, living a very good life, but that stigma has remained with her. And so some of the things that would have affected her negatively, she would have been bullied. She would have lost certain college internships. She had difficulty finding a place to live, and she would have lost a number of employment opportunities. And also, Mr. Deputy Speaker, even though she would be removed from that register at age 37, for 25 years she remained on that register. And we all know, even when she's removed, because that information would have been on the register and out there on the internet, the information is never ever totally removed. And so we have situations where a person's life could be negatively impacted, possibly for the rest of their life, because of a mistake that they would have made. Now, this is not to say, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that I believe sexual offenders, because they were a child, should be treated totally with kid gloves and should not be held accountable. I appreciate the approach we adopt in Trinidad and Tobago with our suite of legislation that treat with children in a particular way. And so we have those children placed in community residences, and we have probation officers or welfare officers assigned to them so that they can monitor compliance with the sentence or the sanction and act as guides to those persons seeking to have them rehabilitated. Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the legislation, when I looked at it, there was one area that I had a concern with, and I'm going to raise it here. Maybe the Attorney General may wish to look at it. And this takes me back to 1994. In July of 1994, I think Trinidad would have experienced one of the most heinous crimes. And it was committed by two persons, one of whom was 15 years, 6 months. And I'm speaking here about Mr. Chuck Atin. And what they would have done was raped and murdered two women in their homes with a child or children present. Now, we may say, okay, he was a child, and based on the legislation, he would be exempt from the National Sex Offenders Register. But I just want to caution that we need, in doing our assessment, we need to look at these child sex offenders differently. We need to ensure that there are mechanisms in place to assess these offenders so that we can identify the reasons for their actions, we can identify treatment strategies and match these with the developmental needs of the child, and we also need to monitor and evaluate these persons. Also recognizing that there may be a need for family involvement in the whole rehabilitative process, because when these things happen with a child, it affects the whole family and sometimes the community. And I'm saying this here, Mr. Deputy Speaker, because the research that I did suggests that the lack of appropriate treatment is likely to invite further victimization or similar offending actions, and thereby increase the pool of offenders. So I raise this issue here today simply for us to be mindful of what could happen and that we need to take the right action. Because in also doing my research, I look with respect to the same Chuck Atin. I think it was in 2010, his case may have come up for review to make a decision in terms of whether he should be released, because I think he has been in jail about 25 years. And one of the reasons cited, because they said he has shown that he's been remorseful and they believe he has been rehabilitated. However, within the penal system, the main reason advanced for not releasing him is that he does not have the necessary skills whereby he can be employed and stand on his own. And I think as a society, we have to take some responsibility for that, because it should have been incumbent upon us over the last 25 years to also seek to ensure that he would have gotten some of the skills necessary for him to be assimilated into the society based on the social needs of the society, and to be able to provide for himself also. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I also wish to make speak to one further point. I know there were some concerns expressed today in terms of we would have established the register and it had not been populated to date. And there is a concern that despite this excellent legislation, if it is not operationalized properly, we may not see the benefits of it. But I am very heartened by Section 67A, where the minister has a responsibility annually to lay in both houses of Parliament reports on the administration of the Act. And I believe, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that will force all of us, all of the sectors, to ensure that this legislation is properly operationalized so that the people of Trinidad and Tobago can benefit from it. And so, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I want once again to commend the Attorney General, to also commend the Special Select Committee members on both sides of the Parliament for recognizing that this legislation is so important that we do not look along political lines, but we look in the best interest of the people of Trinidad and Tobago, so that at the end of the day, we can treat with all sexual offenders in the best way possible. I thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
I recognize the member for Prince System.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, for allowing me to make a brief contribution with respect
to your colleague, Karini East.
No, he's giving way to me.
Oh, you give, okay. All right, Prince System.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, for allowing me to make a brief contribution with respect to the bill that is currently debated before the House. Mr. Deputy Speaker, When I first became a member of Parliament, I understood that my role and responsibility as an opposition member was not only to be critical of the government, but also to make suggestions and to also put forward proposals that I believe would be progressive to the advancement of Trinidad and Tobago. Particularly, one of the interests that I've had since becoming a member of Parliament is dealing with children's rights and children's issues. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, I say this because on February 5th, 2016, all three daily newspapers carried a headline, MP calls for the establishment of a sex offenders registry. The MP that was referred to in that article published on all three daily newspapers on February 5th, 2016 was the MP for Princestown. And I made this call against the backdrop, February 5th, 2016, yes. I made this call against the backdrop of a situation that occurred in my own constituency. And that was a situation where you had a repeat offender raping two young children, a 5- and 7-year-old, and then proceeding to hang himself in a public cemetery in the constituency of Princestown. And it was against that backdrop I thought to myself as an MP that our electorate and our citizenry requires much more of us as elected representatives, in that we are not only here to be critical, but we are also here to advance solutions. And I believed at that time that this was one ambit of the law that, if implemented and if passed, would have stopped or curtailed the amount of repeat sex offenders, especially committing offences and crimes against children. Mr. Deputy Speaker, since then to now, 2016, 2017, 2018, I have repeatedly, through questions, and it is on the Hansard for all to see, I have kept raising this issue in terms of when could we expect the legislation, how far did we progress and proceed, when next would the select committee be meeting, etc. Mr. Deputy Speaker, when I first raised this issue in 2016, CNC3 and The Guardian reported that the Honourable Attorney General responded to my call for a sex offenders registry. And at that time, the response from the AG was lukewarm, in that the AG said that a sex offenders registry already existed. But Mr. Deputy Speaker, when I made the call in 2016, it was understanding that one already existed, but also the AG, when he spoke earlier today, told us about the challenges since 2000 to where we are today in terms of the variant of the law, one, but also in terms of the challenges of the operationalizing issues in terms of getting the law going because of those variances, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, there's one recommendation that I looked at, because I know my colleagues from Faizabad and Couva North and the member for Kumoto Mansinla dealt substantially with the clauses of the bill and the challenges that we had. Not many challenges, and I do believe that several members who have spoken thus far, and including the Honourable Attorney General, would give us some clarification on specific issues that was raised in particular by the member for Faizabad, who really did a clinical job in terms of dissecting the bill clause by clause and section by section. Mr. Deputy Speaker, one of the last speakers, I believe it was a member for Lupino Bonner West, made mention that the bill does allow for the public to have access to the registry and so on, and that it will be made public. Mr. Deputy Speaker, page 20 of the bill, section 47(1, specifically indicates that the registry will not be public, and therefore I believe that is a good case, a very good case for a public awareness campaign, because if legislators are having issues in terms of not fully understanding what the bill is about, one, and the parameters in which the sex offenders registry will function and operate, I do believe that one of the suggestions made in the other place by Independent Senator Paul Richards for public awareness campaign, I believe it is a good one, and we saw an example of that through... No, ma'am.
Okay.
I believe that it is a good case for a public awareness campaign. Mr. Deputy Speaker, those were a few of the issues that I really wanted to raise, and also to indicate, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that another call of mine, another suggestion of mine to further help and protect children, separate and apart from the sex offenders registry, that I'm happy to see coming to fruition today. One of the other areas that I would like to call for is also for government to look at parental responsibility legislation, which was also something when I suggested was met with a very lukewarm response from government. But today we can see that some of the suggestions provided by the opposition in all sectors are starting to take effect in terms of the government looking at it. It might be 4 years later, but it is also something I think that will contribute significantly to some of the challenges in this country. And again, as I said, I call for the National Sex Offenders Registry. I'm very happy to see where it is today. I do believe that there are some limitations and there are some challenges, but in discussions with the Honorable Attorney General, we do know that it is a good starting point. There is work to be done, and progressively we will continue to improve upon the law. But I would really like to see, separate and apart, also parental responsibility legislation in terms of a progressive parliament going forward. So I thank you, and I think that this is a good step in terms of the further protection of children in Trinidad and Tobago. I thank you.
Very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It is a privilege and an honor to be able to rise and contribute to this debate. The members on both sides have been very clear on their support for the concept of what this bill would lead to, and so therefore there's no need to be long, but I think it's very important to be able to add one's voice, especially in this very important circumstance. Mr. Deputy Speaker, in the Express of Monday, 9 September 2019, which is just Monday gone, one of the headlines was "Teen Attempts Suicide After Rape." And that referred to a story where a gym instructor is the person that was being accused of raping this young girl. And with that result, the trauma was so much that she was, attempting to end her own life. And it begs the question, in the case, and I want to look specifically in my very short presentation in terms of this register that I think is so important and so necessary, that in cases where this person could be convicted, I think it's very important that there's some access to this level of information within a community. In a community, Mr. Deputy Speaker, people live together, people associate with each other. Go so far as to say in the older days that it takes a village to raise a child or a community to raise a child. And therefore, in some communities, it's very, very open. People walk into each other's houses, they eat from each other's pots, and they raise their children of the community together. So in the circumstance where you have a predator, such as somebody coming to live in your community that you don't know, even somebody who is there and has these kind of proclivities, it is important that this information is made public in some way. And so I want to look at the fact that between 2013 to 18, we had over 3,700 victims of sex offenses in Trinidad and Tobago. I want to also keep in mind the fact that in 2017, when the U.S. Department of Justice published a National Sex Offender public website, there were some Trinidadians listed on that. And the public in Trinidad and Tobago were very grateful for the information. In fact, one of the comments read, "Please warn your friends and family. We need to help protect and look out for one another. These perverts need to be publicly known." The language may be pejorative, that is the truth, but the point is, Mr. Deputy Speaker, it is very important information, especially when you have young ones growing up in a community. It's important to know who you can trust, who you cannot trust, and who you have to look out for, because you may very, very well be opening up your children to circumstances that you would not believe would happen to them.
That is so true.
I want to also raise the point that the register on its own will not heal the victims or cure sexual offenses. That is not at all the intention. But it can act as a prophylactic against the malaise of the sexual offense and sexual violence that we see creeping up more and more in Trinidad and Tobago. And the MP for Tobago East would have spoken about how she feels when she looks at the statistics dealing with the Children's Authority and what our children are going through. And therefore, anything that can help in any way is extremely important for us to consider. Mr. Deputy Speaker, also important is to consider that the TTPS media release that was done in November 2018, they had a media release that dealt with a sex offender in Chaguanas. He had already been convicted several times, And having been caught on this particular offense, he was to be put on several ID parades. So that means, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that he could have been figuring in many serial sex violence crimes and going unnoticed, slipping under the radar because he is not identified as a sexual offender, and so he may have been slipping under the radar there. And that, to me, is a very frightening thing. I remember years ago going to UE, one of the things that you were told at the first instance when you got into UE was very careful how you go along the dark pathways and so on, because there are people who are there. There are many victims of some of the crimes along there. So this issue of identifying and looking at the sexual offenders, I think, is a very important one. And so as we speak about the register, which is what I want to deal with, understanding that the register will be established and understanding that the website, though, that publishes some of the information is going to be available to the public. Now, that doesn't mean that every single offender will be there. However, just the fact that there's a start in exposing this information to the public, to me, is a very, very critical thing. Because by allowing persons to slip under the radar, we are opening up the circumstance for them to be repeat offenders, for them to exist in a community, living in a home next to you, and you don't even know that they are that type of offender, to be able to put the strictures in place for your children and to protect your community. Mr. Deputy Speaker, what I also think is a very important thing is that those who committed sexual violent acts in other countries, once they reported to Trinidad and Tobago, they are also going to be included on the register. And I think that's very important. We are facing a circumstance now in Trinidad and Tobago and in other countries where deportees are a regular circumstance. And we have been looking at the impact of the deportees on the crime situation, and sometimes they come at very sophisticated methods of performing the crimes that we may not be too accustomed to in Trinidad and Tobago. So again, understanding who they are, identifying who they are, to me, is a very important thing. I also want to commend, I'm seeing some of the offences that are listed in the bill. List penalties for officers who do not follow the law. It also lists penalties for offenders who do not register and so on. And this, I think, is very, very important because it puts particular timelines also onto some of these things that have to happen in order for the registry to function effectively. And those timelines, I think, are very important because it gives you a clear understanding of whether you have contravened the law or not, and if you have done so, then the penalties will flow from that. So it gives an opportunity for effectiveness and efficiency in terms of keeping the law and ensuring that that register is well kept, well maintained, and we have the information that we need. And I dare say, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I would hope that more people get onto the register than not, because I, for sure, as a citizen of this country, living in a community that is fairly open and fairly easygoing, I would want to know if a sex offender is in my community or if they have moved into the community. I want to know that as a citizen. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I really want to commend this legislation. I want to commend the team that would have worked on a special select committee to ensure that it is brought to the House. I think it's timely, very important, and I want to look forward as the rest of the population to what this can bring to Trinidad and Tobago in terms of your safety, your feeling of safety and security, and having the information that you need to be able to exist comfortably in your community, wherever it may be. So I want to commend this legislation to the House and thank both sides, because I see the support coming from the other side, for this legislation, which will make a difference in our beloved country of Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you, Deputy.
I recognize the member for Caroni East.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Just a few questions and a few areas I have some concern in terms of the answers are not easily forthcoming. And I want to bring this to the attention of the Attorney General. Perhaps when he's winding up, he can give some more clarity on the issue. The first area is related to sections 36, 38 and 40, and these are areas in the bill conditions for taking an intimate sample, collection, packaging, storage, and delivery of sample. And those are two of the critical areas. And my medical colleagues will probably attest to the difficulty. If a complainant who has gone through some difficulty and is taken to the police and they need sampling, there is difficulty in ascertaining where that sample has to be taken and who can the police go to in ensuring that the sample is taken. From my understanding, being associated with the Ministry of Health and so on for a while, generally it goes to the district medical officer, the DMO. And the DMO sometimes might not be available. He might not have an office. It might be in the night. And therefore, to collect samples and so on proves to be very difficult. Then at that office, they may not have the necessary tools, well, not in medical language, the necessary instruments and equipment and sampling boxes and so on to take the samples. And if I may just say from my specialty, let's say you want to take a high vaginal swab to determine whether the seminal fluid is related to the seminal fluid from the accused. You have to take and have to send that to the forensic lab and so on. So you have to have the right containers, the right specimen boxes and so on to put that into, because if it is left to deteriorate within the 12 to 24 hours, it becomes useless. So there should be some system put in place as to who these police officers will take these complainants to, and to ensure that who they take the complainants to they must ensure that they have the adequate facilities and the necessary apparatus and so on to do the investigations. So that will bring some clarity to the whole area of uncertainty in terms of trying to pin down the person who has done the act against the complainant. Then there is the second issue is the issue of the reporting mechanism. Honorable Attorney General, and I've been in this business for a long time, working at the Mount Hope Women's Hospital for almost 20-something years. As a consultant, on a weekly basis, you see the new patients. And about 15 new patients are seen by each consultant on a daily basis, 4 days a week. And inevitably, about 8 or 9 of them, of the patients, will be teenage pregnant patients in the antenatal clinic. Now, the reporting mechanism, you as a doctor seeing that child who is pregnant, you have to report it now. But in my years gone by, I try to report it. But to report to whom? When you look for a medical social worker to report it to do the investigations, the medical social worker, you can't find one. So across the country, you would not find the cadre of personnel who will assist you when you want to make the report. Secondly, do you call the police into the hospital where this poor innocent child, 12 or 13, is before you for medical attention, and then you find yourself in the difficulty of you can't find a medical social worker, you call the chief of staff of the hospital, and then can police be called in? So, Attorney General, I would like to see how, or get some information as to this reporting mechanism in terms of the public institutions. Now, the Minister of Education at the moment, and myself from the past, I'm sure he would be experiencing the difficulty himself as I experienced difficulty as Minister of Education, that we know that we have teenage pregnancies amongst children in school. The teacher realizes that this child is pregnant. What does the teacher do? According to this act, the teacher or the principal who finds out that this child is pregnant has to report that or is charged. Now, who do they report it to? They call the police in. Then if they call the police in and the parents of that child or the father of that child may become infuriated, and then the life of that teacher or the principal could be threatened. I understand there was a murder of somebody recently, I believe a teacher, in relation to something similar to that. So, and we know that there are dozens of teenage pregnancies, and since 2006, 2007, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I have been speaking about the scourge of teenage pregnancies in this country. The law is there. At one time, there were approximately 2,500 teenage pregnancies per year. I saw some recent statistics that is coming down a bit, but it is still there. And these are children who have become pregnant for men in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. And the law is there, but very few people are apprehended. Very few people are apprehended. So we have the law, but the apprehension rate is very small. But I believe if we continue to make certain that these people are stopped in their tracks, the society will become a better one. And we will, obviously, we will be reducing the teenage pregnancies and creating a society where these young children have to be mothers, and then there's sometimes a vicious circle. I remember doing some research at Mount Hope many, many years ago. And we researched girls who were under the age of 19 and under. And we found there were over 1,000 of these girls aged 19 who were pregnant, who had 4 children already. 1,000. So when we speak, we collectively, we have come together that we want to pass this bill. Whichever government is in power, we have to make a concerted effort to reduce the amount of teenage pregnancies in this society and encourage those in authority to get the information of who the fathers of these children and start to do some apprehension. So that's my second major point. The third is, as the Attorney General said, the dispensation of justice and the reporting of the cases of sexual offenses from 2000 to 2019, and that will probably relate to both speakers before me, the member for Lopino Bonnet West and the member for Princestown, that the magistrate court between 2000 to 2019, 19 years, for the sexual offenses, none was ordered on the registry. And in the High Court, out of 232 cases, none were registered on the registry. So AG, Honorable Attorney General, your colleagues spoke about the importance of the registry, but the judiciary does not seem to want to put people on the registry, even though they have committed a sexual offense and they have been found guilty. I think you mentioned in the High Court 232 cases found guilty, and in the Magistrates Court 1,401 between 2000 to 2019, but yet still none put on the registry. And I know that there are a number of types of offenses that will be put on the registry on the website, but how do you cannot influence the judiciary. So how would you be managing that issue? One more area is the area of the mental disease. A lot of these patients are people who have been found guilty have to undergo some mental testing. And they need to go to psychologists and psychiatrists and so on. But we have a shortage of these in the country. And so therefore, if there are 3,000 cases of sexual offenses in the registry in 1 year, and the offenders, let's say there are 3,000, can they be afforded, can they be brought to have mental evaluation? 3,000 people. If you find them, you find the culprits, how do you measure, how do you deal with the mental evaluation of 3,000 people in 1 year? So these are some of the practical issues that I wanted to pose to the Honorable Attorney General. And so while we support the bill, there are still some confounding issues that need to be worked out. And the last one is the forensic science lab and the forensic testing. The Honorable Prime Minister, when he went to Jamaica about 2 years ago, at the invitation, I believe, of the university, he visited the Forensic Science Center at the University of the West Indies, and he was quite impressed. And he mentioned that he would like to see Trinidad and Tobago with a similar Forensic Science Center. I don't know whether the Minister of National Security now or the past Minister of National Security can give any statement related to how far we have gone in modernizing the Forensic Science Lab. And there is serious deficiency in terms of when you take a sample, you send it to the Forensic Science Lab for analysis, you can almost count that it is not going to be analyzed within a year or two, even though you send it to international institutions to get the results of the analysis in the trial. And this is why so many of these trials take a long time, because the analysis, the DNA analysis has not been returned. So you have a paucity of workers in the DNA labs, in the forensic lab as well. And you do not have the mechanisms for efficient and swift management of the samples that go to the lab, so that you will get the results, and when the case is brought before the trials, they will have the answer for it. So these are the areas, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I thought I wanted to raise, also to congratulate the speakers on both sides and the work that the Special Select Committee did. And I looked at it, they had over 18 meetings, voluminous, and a number of stakeholders. So I asked my colleague from Princestown, member for Princestown, when one of our members, Member Ramdeen, and two members, Member Ramdeen and Anita Haynes from the Senate, I want to congratulate them on the, and of course the other members from the government, the tremendous amount of work they did. This is sexual offences bill, the children's bill. These are two very important pieces of legislation which we should be proud of, but the management of the issues under there, this is where we are falling down. So we need some greater management efficiency. We need the systems to work. We need the human resource personnel and the facilities. Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
I reckon Sando East.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, along with Caroni East and all other speakers before me, I too would like to join with members of this House in commending the Attorney General as well as members of the Special Select Committee in doing their work to come up with this bill for consideration before us here today. And I too, Mr. Deputy Speaker, would like to express my support for this bill to amend the Sexual Offences Act. There was something that the member for Caroni East had mentioned and requested some sort of clarification from the Honorable Attorney General. And I believe the member for Caroni East misread sections 37, 38. Yes, I believe that he misread it, and I would bring some clarification. It's not a situation where the complainant would go to the police and make a complaint, and the police would then, at any time of the day or night, take the complainant to a hospital or to be medically examined. This part, the new part 3, actually deals with compensation for virtual complainants. So it's only where someone is charged, and charged for the specific offenses of rape, grievous sexual assault, incest, sexual with a mentally subnormal person, sexual penetration of a child, and sexual touching of a child. Only when the person is charged, only then would that person be taken, with or without consent, to be medically examined to determine whether or not that person has a sexually transmitted infection. And with respect to the virtual complainant has a choice, and they have 3 months within which to make up their minds whether they wish to be examined, medically examined or not. So that is the issue. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I would also like to commend the Attorney General for the amendments proposed in Clause 9, which mean to expand the categories of persons, expand the categories of special relationships, where a statutory obligation is now placed for reporting. Mr. Deputy Speaker, while offences can be committed by omission, it does not really follow that everybody is under an obligation or under a duty to act. And of course, Parliament can, through legislation, cause persons to have a duty to act by placing statutory obligations upon them. And the common law recognizes certain special relationships where persons have a duty to act, and the most popular one, obviously, is between parent and child. Mr. Deputy Speaker, this Clause 9 now expands those categories of persons who are under a duty to act where there is suspected sexual abuse, where children are concerned. And as the Attorney General would have alluded to, a psychologist, a psychiatrist, police officer, etc. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, the impact of that is really to widen the net, to increase the opportunity to detect these cases of sexual abuse. Because, Mr. Deputy Speaker, where victims of sexual abuse is concerned, or are concerned rather, they're usually not willing to share that secret, and there is a lot of psychological trauma that goes along with that. And especially where children are concerned, there are a number of obstacles and a number of difficulties. Children, their vocabulary is not as advanced. Children are more susceptible to threats, etc. So what we're doing here is to increase the categories of persons as well as the categories of special relationships, because those persons who are now named in these categories, they are more likely to come into contact with children and to determine where sexual abuse is occurring. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I thank you for this very short intervention. I'm very happy that those on the other side of the aisle have joined with us. I commend the Honorable Prime Minister, I commend the Attorney General, those members of the Special Select Committee for coming up with this for assisting, supporting this piece of legislation as we in this House do what we are here to do to protect those most vulnerable in society. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I thank you.
The member for Laventille West.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, quite a lot has been said on the measures that are before us here today, in the other place, and in this place today. Quite a lot has been said, and I can frankly say that the major issues have been satisfactorily traversed. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the tone from my friends on the other side suggests, experienced as we are, that they are going to lend support to these measures, and it is testimony to the fact and the value of joint select committees. These measures found itself before a committee. They started meeting in the month of February, and they finished a couple of months after that, after I think about 7 or 8 or so. 12 in May, 12 meetings, good attendance, good steady work outside of the public gaze. And it really highlights the value of that technique in terms of the affairs of the Parliament. It allows parliamentarians on all sides from both houses really to go through the issues, to understand them, because very often, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I've sat here as the proposer of legislation or supporting legislation from this side and hear spurious arguments coming from elements of this House, and you wonder sometimes where that is coming from. It is rooted in ignorance. But in the Joint Select Committee, that ignorance is obliterated. People have a chance, clause by clause, to go through and to understand what is, and it is evident from the course of the discussions here that there's a good understanding that we have not only in Trinidad and Tobago, but we have in the world a serious problem. I heard it said once that if the HIV circumstance or condition was spread through the human family by what we ate, it would be far easier for a human being to decide I'm eating this or I'm not eating that, I'm drinking this, or I'm going here, I'm not going there, if it had to do with that. But because HIV is to a large extent, though not exclusively, spread by human interaction in terms of human intercourse, a basic driving instinct of the human being, then it is much more treacherous, much more difficult, and the condition has spread as it has for that reason. And therefore I say that, Mr. Deputy Speaker, for us to just for a moment focus on the fact that what we're dealing here is not purely a question of law, not purely a question of an amendment to the Sexual Offences Act, but we are attempting to treat with one of the most basic elements of the human animal. And it is for that reason emotive, and it is for that reason very, very, very difficult. What we are trying to do as a parliament on behalf of the 41 cross-sections of the society that we represent here today, this evening, is to find, and I think we have, common ground. We are to reflect a common shared morality in Trinidad and Tobago, notwithstanding our differences, notwithstanding differences in ages, religions, political tastes, and all of that. But we have to find a common shared morality, which this bill is attempting. It was first attempted in 1986. We have had some amendments along the way, and even before 1986, you had other pieces of legislation trying to deal with this issue because it is obvious to us that we do have that kind of problem. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I would like to think that we have found that common shared morality and understanding that we have, first of all, to protect our women, to protect men in some less expansive circumstances, because the complaints from this kind of law is largely against women. We acknowledge that. And most of all, to protect the vulnerable group, the children in our communities, in our country. We found the formula. And I really think, as I read this bill, in order to prepare for a short contribution in this debate, I think it is as comprehensive as you can have it. And I understand, based on my conversation with the Attorney General, that because of his engagement with the children's package of laws, with the Children's Authority, and establishing all the institutions under that package for the protection of children, and having applied his mind to the vexed question of child marriages and having dealt with it, and as my colleague, Member Dayal Singh, the member for St. Joseph, pointed out today, and I don't want to disturb anybody's spirit, but I must say, he very pellucidly explained that the lofty position claimed by one of my colleagues on the other side, that we supported that bill to remove marriages under the age of 18 and to allow mature human beings at the age of 18 to contemplate whether or not they want to get engaged in marriage and the things that flow from being married, as opposed to being thrust into it at the age of 11, age 12, and with all of the troubles that brought. A lofty position was made, and the member for St. Joseph clarified it gainfully. For me, as a politician, I saw an overthrow of the authority of the member for Siparia by her colleagues in this House because she had directed her colleagues in the other House to vote against it. So I want to commend them. That is what I'll commend them for taking a strong stand in the interests of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. And they know themselves. I don't have to identify them. They may be punished, but they did it. And it is to all of our benefit, and we understand that. But this bill, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is rather comprehensive. And in my reading of some of the contributions from the other place, I saw a strong submission. I think it was from a member of the opposition. Yes, the then Senator Ramdeen. I must be the first person calling his name in this House for months because he was easily forgotten. Nobody missed him or misses him. But the point is, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the point is, in fact, place feels a lot better. But the point is, Mr. Deputy Speaker, when I read his comments, because you see, I had to in preparation for this debate. He was the driving legal mind behind a lot of the resistance that we saw to legislation that we considered was important for the people of Trinidad and Tobago. And he made the point, lawyer as he is, understanding as he does, that ignorance of the law, as we used to put it, is no excuse. He made the point in his contribution there that a lot of persons who are to be governed by this law may not know it. That might be true. That might be true. But ignorance of the law is no excuse. I heard the member for Princess Tong, a very interesting member of Parliament he is. But I heard the member for Princess Tong say today, in response to the member for Lopino Bonnier, that he needed, and the contribution of the member for Lopino Bonnier was best evidence of the fact that public education should ensue on these measures, with which I agree, starting with her. It was his way of being pejorative. He was trying to be critical of her. And he was making the point that this bill does not provide for publication, for public expression of the registry. And he said it so boldly, persons out of here would not have understood. He needs the public education because Clause 48 of this bill makes provision for the Commissioner of Police, on the order of the court, to put on a website, which is a very public expression, certain information about certain persons convicted for offenses under this act. So any public education should start with the very interesting member for Princestown. And the member for Lopino Bonnier was quite right when she made her submission that there is a provision for public expression, publicity of the elements of the National Registry. Mr. Deputy Speaker, this bill is this law is very thorough indeed. And when we talk about sexual offenses, I just want to, for the benefit of those who may not know, and we may take confidence that everybody knows and take it for granted. This deals with rape, and I think everybody in the country knows what is rape. And I want to say that even if persons do not know the exact terms of the law and how the offenses are defined, every sane human being, and of course this law governs even those who are insane, but who put us at risk, our children, our women, and there are cases like that. But for those who are not of that category, even though you have never read the Sexual Offences Act, even though you never read these amendments, deep down inside of you, because you were created by God, because we are all, for that reason and more, moral beings, we know right from wrong. Even though he never read this law, a man, a woman, an offender knows that what he is doing is wrong, imprudent, horrific. You know, so rape is well known to all of us. But this deals also with grievous sexual assault, where, without the consent of the complainant, he knows that the complainant does not consent, or he acts reckless as to whether they consented or not. He gets engaged in some sexual assault, and this is extorted by threat or fear or bodily harm of the complainant to another. I can tell you, within the last 2 years, I received, and I mentioned it in this house already, I received a complaint from someone in my own constituency about a situation where a young lady was for years, about 3 years, held in captivity, you can say. Not physically, but she was abused routinely by a group of persons, men, under the threat of fear that her mother would be killed. Until finally, after about 3 years, she spoke it out. And when that happened, the police intervened very promptly, arrested persons in flagrante delicto, seized equipment, and the persons were put before the court. I know of a case where a young woman was raped, and I spoke about that in this house already, and I'm sure other members may have known about similar matters, where she was raped. And because of her circumstances and threats that the house in which her old grandmother with whom she lived would be burnt with the grandmother in there, I persuaded her for 2 weeks to go to the police, and she never did. She never did. So this offense treats with those kinds of circumstances where grievous sexual assault, rape, and all of these is extorted by threat or fear of bodily harm to the complainant, or in the case of the, I just told you, another, her grandmother or the girl's mother, is obtained by personating someone else. Sometimes people do that. An identical twin may very well try that. Just to be extreme in my example, somebody may personate somebody else. And we say impersonate, but the word in the law is personate. Or if the activity is obtained by false and fraudulent representations, and those kinds of things. Then you have the business of incest. A person commits the offense of incest who, knowing that another person is by blood relationship, his or her parent, child, brother, sister, grandparent, grandchild, uncle, niece, aunt, or nephew, as the case may be, has sexual intercourse with that person. All of those categories of blood relations constitute incest. And a person who commits such an offense is liable to imprisonment for life. And we would have heard in another debate, in the context of Trinidad and Tobago, and we traversed many aspects of the law dealing with it, life was deemed to be 15 to 25 years. And I think in some ways the court have underscored that. And we dealt with that in another debate recently. Sexual intercourse with a subnormal person, where a person under circumstances that do not amount to rape has sexual, in other words, the person volunteered. The person said yes, but the person is mentally subnormal. And in those circumstances, a very serious offense, punishable with imprisonment for 25 years. And of course, as a palliative, as we always put in the law, on the one hand you have this, on the other hand you have that. It is a defense sub 2, clause 12, subclause 2 says it is a defense for that person to prove that he did not know and had no reason to believe the other person was mentally subnormal. So if he could prove that he did not know, he might have found himself a bit of a defense. In this matter, 12A, a police officer may take into custody without warrant a person who has committed or whom the police officer has reason to believe has committed an offense under these sections 9 to 12, as I've just explained. And then, of course, we have the issue of buggery, a matter that was brought before the courts recently by a visitor to Trinidad and Tobago, Jason Jones, and the matter is on appeal, and the matter is still unsettled, this offense of buggery. Then you have the question of bestiality, where a person who commits bestiality is guilty of an offense and is liable on conviction to imprisonment for 15 years. Bestiality means sexual intercourse per anum or per vaginum. And I'm just reading the Latin phraseology here, by a male or female person with an animal. And trust me, these things happen in this human experience. These things happen. Indecent assault. Well, this is not rape, but a person who indecently, it means an assault accompanied by words or circumstances indicating indecent intention. I want to focus on this a little bit, because sometimes young people, as a criminal lawyer, as a lawyer practicing in the criminal court, I have had cases where persons tell you they did not understand the implications of the joke they were making. So I want those who focus on this parliament today to understand it is no joke. This offense of indecent assault means an assault accompanied by words or circumstances indicating an indecent intention. And that is punishable by a sentence of 10 years. Just so. Serious indecency. Right? And this is imprisonment for 5 years. And it does not apply to an act of serious indecency committed in private between a husband and wife, a male person and a female person, each of whom is 16 years and above or more, both of whom consent to the commission of the act. An act of serious indecency is an act other than sexual intercourse by a person involving the use of a genital organ and so on and so on. Procuration and defilement of the person. Detention, this is one I also want to focus on, because sometimes in joke or pretending that they don't understand the seriousness, and this one says, a person who detains another against that other's will, in or upon any premises with intent that the person detained may have sexual intercourse with any person or in any brothel, is guilty of an offense and liable on conviction to imprisonment for 10 years. Abduction of a female, clause 20. A person who takes away or detains a female person against her will, boyfriend or girlfriend, that don't matter. You take a female away against her will to marry her or to have intercourse with her, or to cause her to marry or to have intercourse with a male person, is guilty, and that imprisonment is you're liable to imprisonment for 10 years. And in today's world, Mr. Deputy Speaker, on the question of human trafficking, and all of the other peripheral issues that confront us as a society, confronts the world. These matters are very important. And one of the reasons why I'm going through them is that persons out there in the society on whose behalf we speak from our various constituencies must understand that these have serious implications. Living on the earnings of prostitution. Clause 23. A person who knowingly lives wholly or in part on the earnings of prostitution or in any place solicits for immoral purposes is guilty of an offense punishable on 5 years. And so the offenses in this Sexual Offences Act continues. Clause 29 says, the offenses under Section 4, rape and sexual assault involving children shall be heard in camera unless the court otherwise
Deputy Speaker,
directs.
48-1, please. 48-1. I couldn't help myself.
Again, remember you. I know you are quoting from the particular bill, right? And you, I think you are going it through in detail, right? And I know we would have had some various members, doing that, and also with the AG. So I don't know if you can, kind of appreciate a little bit first, please.
I think it is important for me to say in passing that in 29A, the provisions of Section 19B of the Administration of Justice Miscellaneous Provisions Act applies mutatis mutandis. That is to say, the admissibility of video recorded evidence. So we have made provision for that in this law, and so it goes. We are amending, since my friend has an issue with the bill, and he wants me to focus on the amendments, in Clause 31A, we have deleted some elements, so that is the amendment, and we have replaced that. Well, we are saying simply, a person who prevents a child from giving a statement to the police or from testifying or forcing the child to recant a statement is also guilty of an offense. And so the offenses under this act continue. The real issue of contention in both the other place and here, and it is no longer, fortunately, an issue of contention, is about the question of the National Registry and its publicity. I think I treated with that apasa. Everyone addressed it in great detail. And I must record my own personal view, representing the people of Laventille West, that I have absolutely no difficulty with the public, like the member for St. Anne's East. I have no difficulty, and the member, of course, for Couva North, they agree that we can publish, and we should. And while there might be some risks, because it is if you wind up with a note on a court order on your passport, wherever in the world you go and you present that passport, whether for travel purposes or for simple ID purposes in a business place, in an office, anywhere, then those to whom you present it will become aware that you are a sex offender. And that could create some disadvantage. We have recognized in this debate that in some societies, in some places, people come under attack once they are known. Persons are chased out of certain towns across the world because of having a conviction or even an allegation of some sexual offense. So there are some risks for the individual. But as we engage in this balancing act and try to protect the children and protect the women, and in some cases protect men, whether they are from Port of Spain or from Princess Town or wherever, as you try to protect them, then you will find, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that this is important. So I support the publicity on the order, and there's a protection in here. It is not simply that the commissioner will take the registry and put it on his website. If the court orders, and of course submissions will be made to the court to justify the need for that, and a whole host of matters will naturally be taken into account, and the court in its own deliberate judgment will say yes, and the commissioner will be so notified, and he will put the information on that sex offender on the website, rendering it as public as you could have it. And I say so specifically now that he's in the chamber. The member for Princestown who felt otherwise, it is right here in black and white, but of course he may have some difficulty understanding it because, but we understand. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, one of the things, as I conclude, that troubles me, and I'm grappling with this, and I'm sure most of us, if not all of us, have to grapple with this. No one, just as how so far we have not gotten the full story on the adverse consequences of using cellular phones. There are some people who say it's frying our brains. There are some people who say it's harmless. People will tell you don't keep it in your pocket next to your left front pocket next to your heart. All these bits of advice, because it generates some measure of radiation. Some people say it's safe, other people not. Just as we use them, some people have 2 and 3 cell phones. Just as we are unsure about the impact of that, I am equally unsure, Mr. Deputy Speaker, about the impact of the wild and available pornography, sex videos, songs, and other such material, and how that impacts the human being. I am unsure about it, but I have a suspicion that it is generating some of the problems that we are seeing. I attended a member for parliamentarians, a program in London about 2 years ago, and this matter and the matters of the darknet raised by my friend for St. Joseph came up. And when the issue of pornography came up, I was quite surprised, based on my own experience, my own common shared morality with you as a citizen of Trinidad and Tobago, a citizen of the Caribbean region. I was absolutely surprised when there were members of Parliament and others in that conference who were making the point that absolutely nothing is wrong with pornography. That was strange to me. I mean, and I recall my early days as a law student. I would discover that homosexuality, for an example, is not unlawful in some parts. It's unlawful in other parts. Again, it ties into the question of the morality commonly shared in that particular society. In some places, obscene language is not an offense, and it's an offense, a criminal offense, though summary in Trinidad and Tobago. But I think, certainly speaking, as I wind to my own conclusion, and to lend strong support to these measures, every one of them, in the interest of the protection of our children and the people of Trinidad and Tobago, and those who visit us. I am not certain, but I believe those exposures are creating a certain state of mind in the minds of the children. Because the children of our nation, those who we are trying to protect, they have easy open access, and I suspect there's nothing we could now do about it. The genie is already out of the bottle. But they have easy access to these things, and it is generating some of the problems that we are trying to treat with in this law today. So on the one hand, we're here trying to shut the door and to protect us from the wiles and the sickness and the behavior of some predators. And on the other hand, they are being fed from other parts of the world and in other forms and techniques. So we have a little conundrum. So this will not be the last of this. We'll have to be here again to amend this, maybe not in this session or the next, but this is an evolving issue, and I'm very happy to be associated with the amendments that are in front of us today, and to say on behalf of the people of Laventille West, I give on their behalf strong support to these measures. Commend the Attorney General, commend the team, commend all who participated in this, and commend my colleagues today who contributed. Mr. Deputy Speaker, with those few words, I'd like to thank you.
I recognize the Attorney General.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I wish to thank all honourable members contributing to this debate today. It is refreshing to have a unanimity of purpose. It is refreshing to have that focus centered upon the protection of those who are most vulnerable in our society. And I wish to warmly congratulate all honourable members for their reflections, their observations, and indeed their support offered here this afternoon, now into tonight. Mr. Deputy Speaker, there are a few matters only to be addressed. I wish to thank my colleague, the Honourable Member for Laventille West, in conjunction with my other colleagues, in particular the report coming from the Honourable Member for Tobago East, as amplified by other honourable members, providing for that balance between a reflection on the law and also on a reflection upon the operational measures for the protection of children. The member for Tobago East certainly had a very fulsome response to the member for Couva North on the particulars of the continuation of programs and policies and the hard purchase that has happened of real results that the honourable member, as a member of Parliament, as a member sitting in the office of Prime Minister with responsibility for gender affairs, has demonstrated. The honourable member for Faizabad brought forward a few critical points that I think need to just be dusted off and addressed. I thank the honourable member for raising those issues. Certainly, the honourable member asked about the definition of sexually transmitted infections, noted that the definition included HIV, and wondered whether the definition would fit within precision and whether it could in fact be amended by way of subsidiary legislation, meaning rules or regulations, as Section 69 of the law permits rules and regulations to be offered. The fact is that we are not, Section 68 where regulations can be offered. The fact is that we have hung the legislative hat on the peg of what was before. The general interpretation of sexually infectious diseases is intended to apply. That will fit within the parameters of the Interpretation Act, where the law continues to speak as a living, breathing entity in and of itself. What we wanted to do was to include the specifics of HIV. This, I must add, is anchored in a very particular way. Part 3 of the legislation, which treats with the concept of a sexually infectious disease, Part 3 of the legislation is very specifically intended to deal with compensation of virtual complainants. Let's put it in simple terms. First of all, compensation must be applied for within 4 years of the virtual complainant becoming aware of the risk of infection. For those who are not aware as to what a virtual complainant is, it means the real victim. When you get to a court and you start off in the magistracy, the complainant is the police officer who brings the charge against the defendant, and the virtual complainant is in fact the victim. So for the benefit of the record, for those watching on who are not familiar with legal terms, VC or virtual complainant refers to the actual victim. Part 3 of the legislation requires that the victim has a shot at compensation under this law in addition to other laws that exist. So it runs concurrently with other laws. There's the general law of tort, meaning wrongdoing in the civil context. There is the general law under the criminal compensation injuries legislation. And indeed, there are other laws which from time to time will speak. Certainly, there are in existence laws under the children's legislation package, etc., that can manage to work this out. What this law does is that it allows the virtual complainant who is willing and who volunteers, providing express consent, to have him or herself tested for a sexually transmitted disease. And only in those circumstances of consent will that person have the opportunity to have someone who's charged, who is mandatorily tested without consent and with the use of force. That person has a chance to say, look, the chain of causation is so close and unbroken to the event of the rape or the sexual aggression that it is on a balance of probabilities capable of being proved that I, the virtual complainant, I, the victim, contracted the sexual infection from the person who was the aggressor. The honourable member is correct that in Section 38 there's a risk that if the time of the investigation of the virtual complainant is not very short, that intervening circumstances can break the chain of causation. What that does is that it allows the defendant in the civil, pseudo-civil claim the opportunity to say it is reasonable that the weight of your evidence is not strong enough, and that there's a break in causation, and that there may have been an intervening event, a paramour or a person who's in your life who has brought on a sexual infection, and it wasn't in fact the defendant in the particular case. So yes, there's a risk, but what was essential to be preserved in this law was that we would not compel the virtual complainant against his or her desire from being tested. There's no mandatory testing for the virtual complainant. If the virtual complainant chooses not to be tested, well then it's out. If the person is tested far too late, intervening circumstances may arise. So that is where we are. We had to do that to be in keeping with the DNA legislation, where we saw the compulsory testing of a virtual complainant or a victim as being a second aggression. So from a policy point of view, coming from the DNA legislation in 2012, coming forward to this law as we deal with it now, we've kept a consistent policy approach of not re-victimizing the virtual complainant and compelling them to have an examination. The Honourable Member for Faizabad also asked about the mandatory testing, the mandatory examinations and making arrangements, how that is to be done. Those will be fleshed out via Section 68, where regulations come in. This is synonymous to the questions asked by the Honourable Member for Caroni East. Caroni East asked about the sampling and profiling that we would have to have when we're treating with the samples. The Honourable Member referred to the sections, again in Part 3, where we were dealing with sample management, and he referred to sections 36, 38, and 40 of the legislation and asked who the samples would be taken to. Indeed, Section 41(2) prescribes that the samples must be taken with immediacy and submitted effectively with immediacy. The regulations are going to speak to whom, in what conditions, what standard operating procedures, what ISO standards, and I draw a reference immediately, as I said in the piloting, to the DNA regulations, where we dealt with the best-in-class procedures by virtue of regulations. In fact, we intend, almost with immediacy, to have the regulations drafted to deal with storage conditions and then the lines of authority. I wish to say that the TTPS has been very aggressive in its preparation for this law. In fact, the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service has already had the benefit of organizing its standing orders and its regulations and requirements to operationalize this law. Permit me for one moment, I don't want to be pejorative in any sense this afternoon as we deal with such an important issue on a bipartisan basis, but I wish to comfort Couva North. I wouldn't say correct. My dear colleague, through you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, what I can say with certainty, having at the break after the Honourable Member spoke, asked the excellent technocrats who are present with us this afternoon why they had set me up in not bringing forward this massive amount of work that was supposedly done by the Minister of Gender Affairs. They said to me, AG, there is no work. Just to let you and assure you, this work was originated by this government. This bill, this sex offenders registry, was originated by this government. And what I can say in relation to the Child Protection Unit, I'd like to stop for a moment and pay special tribute to the Honourable Member for Point 14. It is the Honourable Member for Point 14, when he sat as Minister of National Security, that brought the staff complement to 169 people in that Child Protection Unit. And that Honourable Member birthed a specialist unit for the first time. That Honourable Member had the benefit of his colleagues in this government, the Member for Tobago East, the Attorney General, having the support of introducing the child advocates, building out the division, putting the specialist prosecutors in the family and children division, bringing forward the products which can operationalize this law. Can we have more police in the child protection unit? Yes. Are they being redeployed? Yes. Are they being supported by child protection agencies in the Children's Authority, the probation officers, the social workers, the bodies that were hired by the judiciary in the hundreds when we birthed the Family and Children Division? You see, honorable members, we took very careful note that we would, in fact, amend laws in as fast a fashion as possible. And I would like to say that we have amended 90 individual laws concerning children. 90. And I'll explain how that was done. Instead of taking the law piece by piece, we did 19 amendments under the Family and Children Division. We did 23 amendments under the miscellaneous provisions. We abolished child marriage. And then we did all of the subsidiary legislation. The Child Rehabilitation Center, the children's homes, rules ×2, orders ×2, the anonymization pursuant to the UN work that we did with USAID and the Judiciary of Trinidad and Tobago. We have done a massive amount of work put into effect at the same time. And I think that this Parliament deserves credit in having a very progressive approach to the protection of children. Permit me, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to also name today a few critical personalities who never get the mention that they should. I'd like to name at the CPC's division, Ms. Angela Moore. I would like to name Ms. Carla Ali. I would like to name at the Office of the Prime Minister, Ms. Gayatri Pargas. I would like to name Master Christian Morris Allen. I would like to name at the Children's Authority, Mr. Benjamin and the entire board, Ms. Stephanie Daly and the past board of the Children's Authority. I would like to compliment openly the lost soul of Ms. Buko, who died in her tribute to Trinidad and Tobago. These are unsung heroes of the public service of Trinidad and Tobago, Mr. Deputy Speaker, who I have had an immense privilege of working with for the last 4 years. And I can tell you, and I certify now, that if it weren't for the passion, dedication, and stick-to-itiveness, unstinting effort of these honorable ladies and gentlemen, our country would be a poor country, lost in darkness. It has been a pleasure and a privilege to be a convening factor, and I will say quite openly, I'm not often egotistical, I will say quite openly that the work at the parliamentary table is complemented by the work at the LRC and the pre-LRCs that spend month upon month of dedicated effort to get this job done. But I pay homage and tribute to the hard-working public servants who have assisted government after government in achieving work product. What is unusual, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is to have an executive mind and an executive cabinet that is willing to sit down and do the work and operationalize it. You see, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we had purchased the benefit of DNA law in 2012. The Honourable Member for Caroni East asked what was happening. It was not until we did the regulations in this Parliament, in this session, that that law came alive. It was not until the member for Point Fortin, as Minister of National Security, saw the retention of the DNA custodian, purchased the software to do the DNA profiles, ordered the kits, brought them into Trinidad and Tobago, the 15,000 kits, etc., that law came alive. It was on the books of Trinidad and Tobago, 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015, without operation. Whether it is continuum in government or not, the point is that there must be an alacrity, an anxious application of operationalization. We could have birthed the Family and Children Division Law, as we did in 2016, and then spent 4 or 5 years to open the courts. No, sir. What we did is to open the courts simultaneously, hire the people simultaneously, do the regulations simultaneously, do the rules of court simultaneously. Get the work done at the same time. It's why I have constantly used, and we in the government constantly use what my Jamaican colleagues introduced me to, the concept of flying the plane while you're building it. You see, the country does not have the luxury of waiting to operationalize in series. It must be done in parallel. And I pay homage and compliment my learned colleagues, as I've done the member for Point Fortin, the member for Tobago East, the Minister of Health, my colleagues at the Ministry of the Attorney General, in the interoperation that we have done in getting this thing done. I will say this, the Minister of Finance doesn't have an easy job, because there are all of these competing obligations that we are vicious about in wanting to get done. And the Minister of Finance has had the very difficult job of underwriting the cost of these equations. Right now we have an aggressive pursuit to open the family court in San Fernando. We're carefully looking at that situation as we have seen the need for operationalization and careful measure. But it is the Minister of Finance's job, in an economy that saw a 96% drop in oil and gas revenue, dropping from $21 billion to $400 million, to have worked the magic that he has. And I compliment the Minister of Finance, the acting Prime Minister today, on that savagery that he is subjected to from his own cabinet colleagues, who are biting on a constant basis for their fair share of the pie to get the job done. Yes. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the honourable member for Caroni East raised the issue of teenage pregnancies. I'd like to point out and remind that it was in the dedication of getting the abolition of child marriage that the AG's office laid bare the statistics on teenage pregnancies. 10,000 pregnancies recorded, live births to children. We laid these figures bare. We showed that there were children in the marriage sector, a 55-year-old marrying a 12-year-old. That's where we had the shock of the UNC's position in saying yes to child marriage. The insistence in the Senate of saying that, I mean, it was terrible to say, but the statement made by the senator sitting on the UNC bench was that child marriage must continue, even in the face of that evidence. Correct. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, when we look at the issue of teenage pregnancies, and as raised by Faizabad, the mandatory reporting requirements do not accept you in the patient confidentiality system of not reporting. Crimes and the breach of that confidence are brought into circle the same way the legal profession manages it. The authority is actually quite ancient. It's Regina versus Cox and Railton. It's a case in 1884, which sets out the fact that you have a mandatory obligation, even as a professional, receiving information in confidence to make the report. But you see, Mr. Deputy Speaker, these things don't come to life unless you start. We hear people offer suggestions all the time. I'll draw an analogy. The creator of Part 4 of this law, Ramesh Lawrence Maharaj, the existing law, this law has been demonstrated to have been badly drafted, not through lack of intention, I'm sure, or noble purpose, but it couldn't work. We had 0 registrations because people don't think the map through. It's the same conversation this country is having on other laws. Should we have a law on sedition? Okay, let's talk about discussing the law, but what is the replacement to the law? How do you balance your society is the question. Trinidad and Tobago needs to have its academic potential, more than just in criticism, offer the solution. We have been fighting as a country, 2 governments back to back, the UNC government, the PNM government, fighting to birth the cybercrime law. Commissioner Gary Griffith, when he was Minister of National Security, brought 2 bills to deal with cybercrime law. It's relevant to this law. It deals with the distress that we're talking about to children, etc. It deals with some of the arguments raised by Carney East. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the rest of the world has cybercrime law. Unfortunately, Senator Mark has forgotten all of the experience when they were in government, will not support the law, at least in public uttering. But the Media Association has been battling with trying to understand its role and purpose. So whether you're talking this law, sex offenders, sedition law, cybercrime law, what's the alternative? Because Couva North asked, how do you protect your children? You can protect your children by the public registry, if a court says so. You can know if someone is a pedophile, if a court says so. Look at the Russian roulette mothers in this country, working mothers in particular play. You bring a nanny home. You bring a domestic assistant at home. You have no clue who this person is. You don't know where they live. You've never been to their home. They visit you. Actually, the tribute I pay to politicians is that we 41 here assembled, we know where our people live. We have the privilege of walking this country from the highest office to the lowest, most humble abode, and we go there. All members go. We all go. I remember vividly my colleague from Point Fortin going down to the Marabella train line as Minister of Housing to witness some housing development works that we were doing there, and then saying to me, I have been a chief of defense staff in this country. I thought I knew Trinidad and Tobago. I have never seen poverty like that in my life. And many of our noble and lovely and beautiful people that work with us in our homes come from right there. This law allows us a bit of a chance at scrutiny, a little bit of a thought inside of the mind to understand what you're doing. There are laws in this country, Mr. Deputy Speaker, there are laws in this country that people don't think about in their pursuits in everyday life, but it's time to let people be a little cautious. Whether it is on sexual offenses and the fact that you may be known publicly. How many times we've heard people say, bring back hangings and do it in public. Bring back the cat o' nine tails and do it in public. Part of this is here, but the balance and measure is here. I'm tempted to raise a particular issue, but I won't raise it here because it'll spoil this debate. I'll leave that for another point. I'm just saying to honorable members, this law is critical for our benefit as a people. This law is what allows us to manage the advantage. My learned colleague, the member, the Minister of Social Development, asked a question about dealing with child sex offenders. My colleague was spot on correct in her observation. And it's true that that issue needs some further exploration. It's true that the Children's Act treats with that, but perhaps as we move along, we can move there. The Honourable Member for Princestown raised the issue of parental responsibility, of how we treat and criminalize with parental responsibility. We have that kind of law criminalized in the Children's Act, people with responsibility for children, but that's something that's going to have to sober itself into operation. Education is key. Public awareness is key. There are times in our lives as parliamentarians, as we make laws for the peace, order, and good government of Trinidad and Tobago, pursuant to Section 3 of the Constitution, where we just need to turn up and say these things are immovable morality points in our life, like child marriage, like abolishing child marriage. I was excoriated as Attorney General for stripping away the 3/5 right, and took the risk to advise the cabinet to do that, just so we passed the law, because we were voted down on it essentially by the statements coming. I mean, honorable members, that's the kind of law that we're supposed to say immediately, hey, that issue, we're not making joke on that.
Non-negotiable.
I remember being told the AG don't know the law, they have no such thing as the right to privacy, is what they alleged I had said. I didn't say that. I said there's no such thing as an absolute right, because the Constitution in and of itself accepts that rights may be derogated pursuant to Section 13 and Section 54 of the Constitution. Imagine we made a mockery of something as simple as that. Over what? Over what? We as a parliament are now dealing with the most aggressive and progressive anti-crime coordination that the country has ever seen. And we are standing in part of it right now. We're sitting in part of it right now. It was in the 1980s that we opened the Hall of Justice. The Honorable Prime Minister has announced, the Cabinet has taken the decision that this Parliament that we sit in, the 11 floors that we are in, are to be the home of the civil courts of Trinidad and Tobago, including the Appellate Division. What does that do? It gives us 65 court facilities for criminal matters. Let me repeat that. 65. 34 courts, 31 chambers. Add that to the multiple courts in Faizabad and at St. Clair in the Children's Court. You are talking about a government that will have birthed in its tenure approximately 72 courts. How else are you going to dealing with a backlog of 44,000 cases, 29,000 preliminary inquiries, if you don't have a courtroom to do it in? This government legislatively took the number of judges up from 32 judges, 34 judges, 32 judges, High Court judges, to 64. 12 Court of Appeal judges to 15. Where are you going to put the judge if you don't have a courtroom? This government birthed the public defender system. Building rented, Stanmore Avenue, 30 bodies to join the Legal Aid and Advice Authority, so that when your trial is ready to go on, you have a judge, you have a courtroom, you have rules of court, you have criminal proceedings rules. Your counsel not ready. He in 4 other courts and can't make the trial. No, sir. We went into the process reform and said, you will get competent counsel as opposed to counsel of choice. That happens this year. Maintenance rules, family and children rules, criminal proceedings rules, process reform. Merging the criminal division, creating the family and children division. What does that do? It stops you from having to go between the High Court and Magistrate Court as if the two don't exist. But how are you dealing with evidence, Mr. Deputy Speaker? In building the plane while we're flying it, we said you need CAT reporters. Transcription evidence takes 4 years to move from a preliminary inquiry to a High Court. Do you know what we did? Mask reporting, dragon dictation. We train 30 people every 3 months. Push them out at CAT reporting speeds as fast as the Parliament does for a whopping sum of $500,000. 30 plus 30 plus 30 plus 30. Transcriptions start to come. But what else did we do? Where are you hearing these sexual offenses? Summary, indictable. The courtroom was not computerized. There were no rules. The Marcia Ayres Caesar fiasco came on the back of the judge not knowing how many matters were outstanding because there was no record other than a manual book. The Chief Justice, who is made the subject of a lot of criticism, largely from members opposite, that Honorable Chief Justice found himself in Nigeria to get the software for free, asked the government of Spain to better the software, and that software is now in the body of TT Jim. That's the name of the software, which allows court mail, electronic filing, FTR, same way we have cameras and transcriptions. Every single court in Trinidad and Tobago has that. Computerized. The dignity is restored in We Pay. The ability to not line up to pay domestic issues.
Honorable EG, your initial speaking time has elapsed. You have an additional 15 minutes.
Should it please you?
Avail yourself.
Yes, sir.
Proceed.
The dignity to the human being, as this bill restores dignity, as it gives hope, dignity is born by making sure people don't have to go for their maintenance payments, line up whole day to put the money in, line up whole day to take the money out. So if a food card or smart pay was good enough for the Ministry of the People in your day, why not court pay? Who objected to court pay? Who said court pay was for the 1% and named Jerry Hadid? The UNC.
Wicked.
One sec. Retract, please. Retract that statement, please. Members. Laventil, West,
Retract
please.
that comment
Retract.
against the UNC, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Just retract the statement for me, please.
Retract the statement, Mr.
Thank you.
Deputy Speaker.
Thank you.
Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm trying to bring what Couva North asked into real context. How do we protect children? How do we make the system work? And I'm explaining to the country through you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, how this system works. But Mr. Deputy Speaker, I was talking about the divisions of court and in the criminal division. What could be more commonsensical, honorable members? We have 43 magistrates, up to 46, working in 14 magistrates' courts and 2 out courts, dealing with 146,000 cases every year in the magistrates' court. 104,000 of those cases are motor vehicle and road traffic offences. 29,000 are preliminary inquiries. 43 people looking at 146. Let's do the math. We have, Mr. Deputy Speaker, 146,000 cases. Let's take away the 104,000 cases. You get 42,000 cases left. Let's take away preliminary inquiries. Let's minus 29,000 preliminary inquiries. You get 13,000 cases. Therefore, by abolishing preliminary inquiries, making it happen because you have now this Parliament building for the civil courts, with a walkway being constructed, with Furnace Smith with 1,000 car parks already set and open, having 64 courts in the criminal assizes, now the Hall of Justice, we're taking the magistrates' courts and we're saying to the magistrates' court, you see your 43 magistrates, instead of dealing with 146,000 cases, you deal with 13,000 cases. What do you think that means for the people of Trinidad and Tobago? It means that sexual offences, as they'll be considered in this bill, get ramped up, Mr. Deputy Speaker. You see, Pointe-a-Pierre said some time ago that the UNC was not going to support certain laws because they finally understood the pieces coming together. Pointe-a-Pierre was talking then about the white-collar laws that we were dealing with, Mr. Deputy Speaker. That's for another occasion. Suffice it to say, the methodology that we have employed in dealing with the laws of Trinidad and Tobago and the reform of the criminal justice system in particular, where this bill is anchored, has never been applied in the manner that I have just described. It is this government and this government in its combined elemental contributory pieces that have caused that to happen, and we will give account for that. Mr. Deputy Speaker, this bill is good law. This bill was the product of a lot of hard work. This bill, much like many of our very difficult bills, passed through the Senate first. You know why? With the greatest of respect to the House can't be trusted on 3/5 majority bills. By far better to get the independent support first. By far better. We saw it in the bail bill. We saw it in the anti-gang bill. We saw it in this bill. Sometimes you just need to take a different approach to the law. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I commend this bill to Trinidad and Tobago. I commend the bona fides of this law for us all, and I beg to move.
Well done.
Honourable members, the question is that a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Sexual Offences Act, Chapter 1128, be now read a second time. All in favour say aye. Aye. Any against? The ayes have it.
A bill entitled An Act to Amend the Sexual Offences Act, Chapter 1128.
Leader of the House, could we have the procedural motion, please?
Yes, sir. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I beg to move in accordance with Standing Order 15.5 that this House to sit until the conclusion of the matter before it.
Honorable members, the question is that the House continue to sit until the conclusion of the matter before it. All in favor say aye. Aye. Any against? The ayes have it. Attorney General.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, in accordance with Standing Order 68-1, I beg to move that the Sexual Offences Amendment Bill 2019 be committed to the Committee of the Whole.
Honorable members, the question is that the Sexual Offences Amendment Bill 2019 be committed to the Committee of the Whole. All in favor say aye. Aye. Any against? The ayes have it. This House will now go into the Committee of the Whole to consider the bill clause by clause. Honorable members, we convene the Committee of the Whole. Honorable members, do I have your agreement to consider all of the clauses together? AG, Chief Whip, nice.
Clauses 1 to 11.
The question is that clauses 1 to 11 stand part of the bill. The question is that clauses 1 to 11 now stand part of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it. Clauses 1 to 11 now stands part of the bill. The preamble.
The preamble.
The question is that the preamble be approved. The question is that the preamble be approved. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it. Honorable members, the question is that the bill be now reported to the House. Those in favor say aye. Aye. And those against say no. I think the ayes have it. We'll now resume the House. Thank you, technocrats, for your time. The House is resumed. I call on the Attorney General.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I wish to report that the Sexual Offences Amendment Bill 2019 was considered in Committee of the Whole and approved without amendments. I now beg to move that the House agree with the committee's report.
Honourable members, the question is that this House agree with the committee's report on the Sexual Offences Amendment Bill 2019. All in favour say aye. Aye. Any against? The ayes have it. The Attorney General.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I beg to move that a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Sexual Offences Act, Chapter 1128, be forthwith read a third time and passed.
Honourable members, the question is that a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Sexual Offences Act, Chapter 1128, be forthwith read a third time and pass. All in favour say aye. Aye. Any against? The ayes have it. This bill requires a 3/5 special majority.
Mrs. Robertson-Regis.
Aye.
Mr. Imbert,
Yes.
Mr. Alwari,
Aye.
Mr. Dial Singh,
Yes.
Mr. Hines,
Aye.
Mr. Mitchell,
Aye.
Ms. Kujo,
Aye.
Mr. Garcia,
Yes.
Mrs. Critchlow Coburn,
Aye.
Mr. Dillon,
Aye.
Mrs. Webster Roy,
Aye.
Dr. Gatsby Dolly,
Aye.
Dr. Francis,
Yes.
Miss Olivier,
Aye.
Mr. Leons,
Yes.
Mr. Antoine,
Yes.
Mr. Smith,
Aye.
Mr. Cuffey,
Yes.
Mr. Lee,
Yes.
Mr. Karam,
Aye.
Dr. Tiwari,
Aye.
Mr. Indar Singh,
Yes.
Mr. Ramadan,
Yes.
Dr. Khan,
Yes.
Mr. Padarat,
Yes.
Dr. Bodo,
Yes.
Mr. Pare,
Yes.
Ms. Ramdia,
Yes.
Mr. Deputy, the result of the division is 28 members voted for, 0 against, and 0 abstentions.
Honorable members, with a division of 28 members voting for, 0 members voting against, and 0 abstentions, the motion for the third reading of the Sexual Offences Amendment Bill 2019 is approved.
A bill entitled An Act to Amend the Sexual Offences Act, Chapter 11, 28.
Leader of the House.
Thank you very kindly, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I beg to move that this House do now adjourn to Friday, the 20th day of September 2019 at 1:30 p.m. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'd like to give notice to my colleagues that we will be dealing with a bill to amend the Government Savings Bonds Act, Chapter 7141. That bill will be sent out with the order paper.
Honorable members. Honorable members, the question is that this House do now adjourn. All in favor say aye. Aye. Any against? The ayes have it. In accordance with Standing Orders 11 and 12.1, this House now stands adjourned to Friday, 20th September 2019 at 1:30 p.m.